Hi there, everybody, and welcome. Jeff Dalto of Vector Solutions and Convergence Training. Today, speaking about safety and safety metrics with Carsten Busch. You might remember we've had Carsten on before talking about safety myths. And Carsten is a safety methodologist and historian, also the Indiana Jones of safety, arguably the coolest title in all of occupational safety. We're going to talk today about his new book, If You Can't Measure It, Maybe You Shouldn't. It's about issues related to safety and safety metrics. And actually, it's about metrics in general. So even if you're not in occupational safety, I think you might find it interesting. This is the second of Carsten's two books. The other was called Safety Myths, or Safety Myth 101. And I think you guys will find this interesting. And with that, let me say hi to Carsten. Carsten, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for having me once again.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have you.
Yeah, great. And I hope everything is going well on your side of the world.
It is, thank you.
We are separated by, what is it, 8 hours, since we're speaking of measuring, so.
Right. Yeah, I had to get up a little early for this one. So thanks for giving me a reason to get out of bed early today. And we'll try to get you started with your weekend soon as well.
Yeah, thanks.
So Carsten, before we start with the Q&A, can you kind of just tell people who you are, what you do in occupational safety, but a little bit about your career and kind of how you see your role and your position in occupational safety?
Yes. Currently, I have a daytime job as it's called Senior Advisor Occupational Safety, and I work for the Norwegian Police Directorate, and we're like the governing unit of all Norwegian police. And I'm not a police officer, but from my background, my background is mechanical engineering, and I immediately at technical school knew I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. And luckily, I came into safety and health and quality, and I've been doing that ever since for now about 27 years, I think. And I would say I have a more than average interest in safety science and practice and history and professionals. And so besides my daytime job, I'm quite active on a couple of safety forums. And I have the pleasure to tutor some students in the Human Factors and System Safety program at Lund University, where I graduated last year. And I do write a lot, among other things, the book you showed. Yeah, and well, my role in my daytime job, I partly work on, collecting data to measure safety, or at least to monitor safety and health, and a lot of other things, because there is a lot of gray areas. And I do work a lot on risk and risk assessments in all kind of forms and shapes, and try to help people to do those better and more useful.
Right,
I think that wraps it up.
Okay, cool. So you've even mentioned getting a lot of safety data, and that's what we're going to talk about today is this idea of measuring safety. And I wonder if you could just maybe to set the scene, or set the scene, I'm sorry, explain to us why people try to measure safety.
Why people? Sorry, the question.
Oh, why do people even try to measure safety? What are we trying to do when we measure safety?
Yeah, I think it's one of those questions that we could spend an hour on, and a lot of different angles. But just some ideas that I have. One is you probably want to know where you are. If you're a manager, like my boss, and somebody asks her, how are we doing on safety? She probably would want to look it up somewhere where it says safety, you got an A or you got an F or anything in between. And then quickly people well, try to get some metrics or data, or maybe just a story about why someone feels, well, we are doing very well or we are doing not so well. So that's one reason to know where we are, how we are doing. The other thing I think, which many companies and organizations use measurements for, is because they try to well, improve or set a goal. And we all know goal setting that often comes with the desire to make SMART goals. And then SMART is the acronym for specific, measurable, acceptable, or any other A. What is realistic and timely, or time bound. And so a lot of people think the M, the measurement, you need some kind of a number. So we need to express safety in a number, like number of deaths, fatalities, number of accidents, incidents, or maybe more positive, how are we doing on our safety plan, or how many safety trainings have we accomplished, or anything like that. So I think that's two main reasons. Where are we and where are we going? It's like driving your car. you start, and then, well, children in the back will be saying, Dad, is it far? And you look at the, well, it's another 12 miles. Yeah.
All right, good. So if we have this logical reason sometimes to want to measure safety, I would assume that your measurements can be influenced by your definition of safety. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Definitely. In the book, I think I used 3 different examples of how you could define safety, and how many people commonly define safety, and how you define safety will determine what you measure, and maybe also most likely also how you measure. The first I mention is safety is seen as an absence of accidents or incidents or injuries, bad outcomes. I think that's a very common and intuitive understanding of safety. If you go on the street and ask people, well, what is safety? Many people will probably say safety, that is not having an accident. So that's easy measurable often, because companies do track that kind of information anyway. They tally and they report to for the compensation, and maybe to the regulator, or maybe to inspectorate, whatever. So that's one way. You define safety as an absence of accidents, and then you count the number. Another way of seeing safety is safety that means following safety rules, compliance with legislation, compliance with some kind of ISO standard. There's this new ISO standard, for example, and maybe internal compliance, which you can measure with audits. And then maybe you're in a bit more proactive mode, where you say, well, okay, we create safety through following some rules, and we can show how well we are doing by some kind of score on an audit or an inspection system or whatever. Totally different from the first one. Then one definition of safety that from my technical background I often used is safety is about acceptable risk. And it's probably much harder to measure, because how do you measure risk? But there are organizations who create heat maps, for example, where they show these are the risks, and we put them in categories, red and yellow and green, and then we have so many reds and we have so many yellows, and etc., which also can be communicated to, well, the world. Then 3 different definition of safety, and 3 totally different ways of measuring and showing what safety is. And I think all of them show one element of safety, and none of them is probably, well, the last one is maybe the best, but the hardest to measure. The others, absence of accidents is not necessarily a good measure of safety, I think, because not having any accidents can also, or having a good score, good number of accidents can be caused by other things, like sheer luck, because accidents are rather rare, luckily. But you can also manipulate the numbers, of course, and hide the accidents. And safety as following rules, compliance. Compliance is not necessarily a good way to express safety, I think, because you can follow rule and die anyway. For example, Piper Alpha accident, you've probably heard of it, some 25 years ago, I think, 92. A lot of people died, and mostly the people who followed the rule died. So, yeah.
So that might have just,
yeah.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. I interrupted you.
No,
okay.
Just you.
So that might have nicely anticipated that my next question, which was going to be about like, well, what are some of the downsides to the way that people have measured safety in the past, or some of the disadvantages? And you mentioned three in terms of talking about incident rate. You talked about the fact a low incident rate could be just luck, so you might not be safe. You talked about how these kind of figures can be manipulated or distorted. And then you talked about the difference between compliance and following rules and safety, and how just because you're following rules doesn't mean you're safe with Bhopal, for example. Are there, besides those, are there downsides or disadvantages to the way that people have traditionally measured safety?
Sorry?
Besides those three examples
Yeah.
of kind of disadvantages to the way people have traditionally measured safety, are there others, or would those be your three primary issues?
Well, I think those are my primary issues. Seeing safety as or expressing safety in a number of accidents, I think it's very appealing to common sense, with all drawbacks of that term. But people can connect to it, and that's a good one, I think. And I think it's even a decent heuristic. If you look at some companies' accident statistics, it may give you a sense of how well they're doing. On the other side, if you see it's zero and people are working in a really high risk environment, which many companies do, then you should get suspicious, I think. And maybe ask for, well, where is the bad news? Because you should have some accidents by all, well, natural means, because you are operating in a high risk environment. And I just, well, maybe you're doing really good, or maybe you're just having luck, but that there must be something. So please tell me. And I think that's one of the main problems with any measurement, is when it gets too important, and maybe too important for other means, because a lot of industries, a lot of companies, when they hire subcontractors, they have some safety requirements, because that's the thing to do. And then they want LTI statistics, for example. And if you have a lot of accidents, that they will disqualify you. So the number of that you have on your safety dashboard, or whatever it is you are using, gets so important, and gets so important for other goals, that it may be very tempting to do something about the number. And there are much easier ways to do something about the number than becoming very safe. You can, for example, stretch the definition, or, well, try to hide something. Okay, that say Carsten gets hurt, but we could say that he fell at home, and then yeah, it's not a work accident.
Right. So there's that
Yeah.
issue of manipulating your data so that your company can get that job. But there's also, I guess, if your company is your company's future and future jobs are beholden to having a low incident rate, it's going to act as a disincentive to ever, have people report things and therefore learn and get better as well.
Yes, and those are probably the real hidden problems with the measurements. If we allow, or maybe not allow, but if these practices start to exist, then we actually are selling ourselves short, because we don't have the input to learn. Trial and error is a very powerful way to learn, and an accident or an incident or even near miss may create some kind of a sense of urgency. Okay, now we really have to shapen up or improve or do something. But if we don't want that information because we have to keep that number low, then well, we're disallowing ourselves learning opportunities. Another thing about measurement that may be problematic is how people see measurement. Because if we speak about measurement, we often think about it in terms of numbers. And numbers are great because they look very precise, and we may give them more value than they actually deserve. If you just report a number like we had 6 accidents last week, so people may think, well, okay, 6, well, that's a good number, it's a low number, it's just 1 digit, but it's really poor information, really, because what does it say? And then if we take the third way to define safety as a color red, or a risk in the red zone, what does that really say? Because where are we in the red? Is it really dramatic, or is it just in a lower red? And what does it really mean? And what assumptions are we making? And what is the context of the risk? It says very little. If you see a heat map, it's okay, just some summary, and you don't know what is bubbling under and what is really the context of these numbers or metrics, or yeah, those measurements, because they are measurements, even if they're not really a number. Colors are also, and smileys and plus and minus, and yeah, thumbs up. Yep.
So they're very reductive, and in that sense, maybe at
Yes.
best, they're the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, at best they should be triggering some kind of question, but people often take them as an answer. They see, okay, well, we have this dashboard, and it looks really nice. Everything is in a low numbers, low digits, and it's probably going well. But they don't know what is hidden underneath. They don't ask for okay, where's the counter evidence, and what does it really mean, and how are we doing compared to last year, for example, or whatever.
Gotcha. So a common phrase that related to this that I think everybody knows, and I'm pretty sure it's in your book, is you can't manage what you can't measure. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I know that Deming did have thoughts about it, and he called it a myth, and a costly myth, because just a measurement says very little. Of course, it's just, well, a number, and the number is not necessarily information. And as I said, often it's also a very poor information. And I think one of the things that Deming was thinking about is the fact that companies and organizations put a lot of effort in collecting data and then doing very little with it. Not really, they don't really learn from it, but they just report and they aggregate and report up and report out to the regulator or whatever or clients. But a lot of effort is wasted on this measurement of really poor, poor information that we don't really learn anything from. And I think instead of measuring, maybe we should look for richer data. And then there's the other thing that I have against the slogan, and it inspired kind of the title of my book, of course. Is it really so that we can't manage what we don't measure? Because that's not how I experience daily life. If I go outside and I'm going to a job, I have to make some decisions. What kind of coat I'm going to wear? Should I take an umbrella, yes or no? And so I'm managing how cold I am and how wet I'm going to be when I arrive at the office. But I don't do any measurements. The only measurement I do is look outside. And I make an assessment, and I think maybe we should rather use the word assessment instead of measurement. I make an assessment of what is it looking like? Well, clouds, rain, snow. Maybe I open the door and feel how cold it is, and based on that minimal information, I make a decision. Yes, umbrella. Yes, coat. I make even take a cap. And I think most of daily life works like that. And most of working life also works like that. If you ask how well you're doing, you're not going to do a measurement. You, well, have some things in your head. And by those things, you give an answer.
Right. It's a good example, I think, of how in a lot of careers and workplaces we have these mental models and ideas that we take as a given, but then if you analyze them a little bit, they can be misleading or distorting, and maybe it's good to have someone like yourself and other people who continually remind us to question these ideas and ask ourselves if they're really providing the value that we think they are.
And I have an example that I think I wrote it down in my book, and it's from real life. We were in a major reorganization, and we got the question, well, how do you know that workload, because we reorganized while we were still working and trying to provide 100% service. How do you know that people aren't getting overworked? And our HR director said, well, we are falling on sick leave and turnover. And I raised my hand and said, sorry, if you're going there, you're already too late. So you're measuring, but it's not giving you any information before it's too late. What we should do is go and ask people. And it's very hard to put asking people something in a spreadsheet or as a number, unless you're going to do a survey, which has drawbacks as well. But just go out and ask people, well, how are you doing? Let's have a cup of coffee and tell me about your working day. And we got really interesting replies, because people said, I know there's a lot of work going on, and we are working too much because I get text messages and emails from my boss at times of the day that I'm not used to hear from him. And the most brilliant example, I must say, was from one of the offices. They said, we know that there is a lot of work coming when we see that people bring toothbrushes to the office, because then they're prepared to stay late and maybe overnight and just work around the clock. So they had a really clear metric that counted the number of toothbrushes in the office. It's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. Those are good examples of the iceberg beneath the surface of the number.
Yeah.
So that leads us nicely, I think, sets us up for my next question. And I believe that I learned from you the word surrogation. And I wonder if
Okay.
you could talk to us about surrogation.
Yeah, and I don't remember where I got it. I think from a brilliant book on psychology, and otherwise, I'm just going to make some advertisement for an author, Ben Goldacre.
All right, good.
He's a great author, and he is a British medical doctor. He has some very nice clips on TED Talks. And I think it was from him or from a guy with a very difficult name I found out about surrogates. And it made me think about safety. Surrogate is when you want to measure something, but you can't measure the thing itself directly. You can't, or you don't want, or it's very difficult because of time or ethical implications, for example. A good safety or an health example is probably the toxic levels of substances. You have these LD50 levels, for example, where this is the level where 50% of something would die. We don't test them on people because, yeah, you can't. So what we do, we test them on rats and rabbits and other animals. So the fatality rates, and then we multiply them by some safety factor and say this applies to people. Roughly, that's a very rough description of the process. So the fatality rate for rats and rabbits in the lab is surrogate for how lethal a substance is for people. And if you take it to Ben Goldacre, he has a lot of good examples of surrogates in medicine, and he cautions for it. Because he says, okay, maybe medicine can reduce the blood pressure, for example, and it can be very effective for that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it actually has the effect on the disease you want to cure, or in the end you want to prevent that from heart failure. And maybe a medicine is very good on the surrogate measure of reducing blood pressure, but maybe it doesn't do a thing for fatality rates. The problem is blood pressure you can measure some hours after you've taken the drug to see if medicine is really effective. You have to wait years because luckily people don't die on a very speedy rate, which is good, but okay, for testing the efficacy of medicine, it's a hassle, of course. So you have to do very long trials before you really know something, but you have the surrogate and you have this theoretical model that it does something. And I think we do the same thing in safety all the time, because it is what is safety anyway? We have a couple of definitions, and there are probably 50 others, and we can't measure safety directly, so we do it always by surrogates. And the surrogates we already had, a number of accidents gives a hunch, but a very incomplete hunch. Compliance gives some sense of safety, but very incomplete. Risk gives some measure of safety, but ignores a lot of other stuff. So we are constantly measuring safety by surrogates, which say maybe something, but don't necessarily well, give the proper picture. Like the well-known example, there was this party on Deepwater Horizon. They had 7 years without an LTI, which they probably, well, I don't know if it was deserved or not. They had this party day after the thing blows up. So they did very well on one aspect of safety, one surrogate, but alas, a disaster struck anyway.
Right. You know,
Surrogates, we really need them. I need to stress this. We need them because we want some kind of a measure, but we have to be very humble and critical. What does it really mean? And especially, what does it not say?
right. I don't believe he uses the term surrogate, but that discussion also fits in nicely when you think about Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and how we have a tendency sometimes when we can't answer one question because it's too hard to answer, the data's not there, or just because we're not even aware of it, we substitute it with an answer to a different,
he
easier
calls it
question.
substitute there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what we are doing often. Yeah, does the drug work? Is it a good drug? Yes, it is, because it lowers blood pressure, and by all means, that should mean that you have fewer heart failures. And the same, well, are we doing good on safety? Yeah, of course. We haven't had an LTI for 7 years.
Right.
Yeah, okay. There was occupational safety, and they ignored process safety, or maybe they didn't ignore, but they were a bit unaware.
So earlier you directly and briefly talked about zero, and what you just said is also related to zero. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about this concept in safety of zero and safety measurement, and what your thoughts are about that.
Oh boy, do we have to? Let me first say that I have worked with great pleasure for an organization which had zero vision, and it worked very well. Without any of the bad side effects. Because one of the things that you often hear when people talk about, okay, we have a vision safety, vision zero in safety, then the first suggestion that comes is, okay, probably nothing gets reported, and it creates an atmosphere of fear and oppression, and people don't report, and you don't learn, and in a long time it's going to damage, etc., etc. And I think those possible negative side effects are very real, especially if zero becomes a goal. And a lot of companies do that, and a lot of companies do it very consciously, because they say, okay, this has to be the goal, because we can't put a number on of fatalities or incidents, because it's just not morally acceptable. I get back to that argument. But I think if you put a number as a goal, it's creating a problem, because it's going to be a very frustrating goal. Because at some point you will not make it. You can make zero for quite a while probably, but you cannot control everything, and at some point an accident will happen. And then your whole year, your whole goal, and whatever is spoiled. What we had at the time, and I'm talking about my time in the Norwegian rail administration, we had a zero vision, and all of traffic in Norway, I think, has a zero vision. And a vision is something else than a goal. Vision is like Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Some way in the future, maybe we hope to get there, but it's mostly a direction. It's, well, we want to go that way, move that way, and we know that we will not reach it in the short run. So we will have some other goals on the way. And I think, well, that's That's just a nice dream that you have, because we want everybody to go to safely home and healthy home after work. And we had passengers. We especially want them safe home, because we want them to return to travel again with us. So we had an extra driver there for doing it as safely as possible. The problem that I have with people saying zero can be the only acceptable goal because morally we cannot say anything else. I would say, why should you have a goal for accidents anyway? Why not have another goal for safety? Like we have this great plan how to improve safety, and we want to fulfill that plan. That's our goal. We want improvement, not avoidance of accidents. Of course, we want avoidance of accidents, but we don't need to express it as a number.
Right. That gets back to the earlier question of what is your definition of safety and how that factors into your measurement. One of the things I find interesting in your talks and in books, and again, this most recent one, is you talk about the difference between outputs and outcomes in safety measurement. Yeah. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I can, and I would appreciate critique on it, because, well, I'm not sure how good the concept actually is. It works in some cases very well, I think. And again, it has its origins in my time in railways. And one of my projects I contributed to was level crossing safety, both in the Netherlands and Norway. And we were measured at the time, and I'm going back way to the early 2000s in the Netherlands. We were measured on the number of fatalities on level crossings. And I found that a very problematic measurement. Of course, we all agreed that the number was quite high. We had about 50 fatalities at the time. Per year on level crossings, and we got a goal to cut that number in half in a certain time. And then we had a great program, and we did it in much shorter. The thing is, the number of fatalities doesn't say a lot about how good our process is. It doesn't say a lot about our activities. Because we built infrastructure, we ran infrastructure, and we maintained it, etc. And in terms of a process, you can say you have design and people and rules and planning and all that stuff, and that's inputs into your process. You run your process, and you get something out. And what we got out was working to certain specifications, a level crossing with barriers that open and closed automatically and gave warning if they weren't working, etc., etc. So I think that's our process, and that's what we controlled: input, throughput, and then we got some output. And output was some kind of product, technical thing, and some human stuff. If you looked at a lot of the fatalities, they were partly due to failures in our process, but it was a tiny proportion. A major part was because of external influences and how they interacted with our process. And then I thought, okay, we have to distinguish between what we do with our process, our output, and then what we measure in the end, which I called outcome. And it wasn't my thought. I stole it from somebody. I don't honestly recall who it was. And I thought that's a really nice way of structuring your process, that you have inputs, you have throughputs, the stuff you do in your process, you have outputs of your process, then some random stuff happens and you got an outcome. And often we are measured, or in railways we were mostly measured on what I would call outcome indicators. Fatalities and punctuality is also often outcome indicator. If you speak about other industries, I'm not sure how useful the distinguishment is. Nevertheless, I think the things most organizations measure, fatalities, etc. And now in the police, for example, we have a lot of problems and also injuries because of interactions with public. People who really don't like that policemen visit them or arrest them or say, could you please keep it down? And they react aggressively and we get injuries. Those are not necessarily, well, what I would call output for us, but rather interference with something else. So
Right.
we can
Right.
only control so much, and I think that's the essence in what I'm trying to say when I talk about outcome. Where is the limit of our control? Output we can control probably much better than outcome.
All right. So if anyone has any thoughts for Carsten, it looks like he's looking for some thoughts on that issue. One of the things we touched on in your you're talking about HR using absentee rates and the like, and that brings up the issue of leading and lagging indicators. And more recently, there's I guess you could say there's always been a big emphasis on lagging indicators. More recently, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of leading indicators, and I wonder if you can kind of talk about that issue.
Well, there are some people who would say you shouldn't use lagging indicators at all. You should focus on the leading one. Leading ones are good and lagging are bad. And I don't really believe that. I think lagging indicators have a lot of disadvantages, but probably also leading ones. And I'm highly skeptical of people suggesting one or the other. I think you need a healthy mix of both. I think, as I said earlier, lagging indicators can be a really good heuristic to get a first sense and to start some questions about, okay, here are a lot of accidents. Why is that so? Yeah, okay, because people make this kind of, well, do this kind of what I'm going to say, people display this kind of behavior. Yeah, okay, but don't they know that they shouldn't do so? Yes, but we have to cut down on training, etc. And then you get something rolling, and you could switch over to leading indicators that say something about training or budget or time available or whatever. So I think you need them both. And you should accept neither as an answer, but well, both lagging and leading, just as a start to ask some smart questions. Why is this so? This looks surprising. How come? Why? And have conversations about it and get rich information instead of just, well, our training rate is 70%. Yeah. Sounds good, but so what does that mean?
Gets us back to the thing about getting richer information and finding the iceberg underneath the tip. So another thing you talk about in the book, if I recall, is benchmarking. And can you share your thoughts on benchmarking and safety metrics?
Yeah. As you know, I'm highly critical about benchmarking, and for a couple of reasons. One thing is that the benchmarking often happens on, again, this is going to be a theme today, on very poor information. Like well, the head of, what's it called? The people who acquire, yeah, I missed the word. The people who hire subcontractors, and are doing a benchmark between the various subcontractors on how safe they are.
Right.
And they just look at the LTI number, and maybe they look whether they have an ISO certificate, or and that's about where it stops. They don't really go out and look. Maybe they do. Some organizations do. I know. But mostly it's an office job. They look at some numbers, they look at some papers, and then decide what to choose. And I think that's a really poor benchmark, and that's how many benchmarks are done, just on a number, and maybe on a practice where it's questionable whether this practice is appropriate for each organization. And I've seen this clip by Russell Eckhoff. I don't know if you know the name.
I don't.
He was a great thinker within systems thinking, and I think he should be on the standard of Deming. And he has this great story where he tells, what if we would make a car and only use the best parts from every car, like the suspension from a Ferrari, and the seats from a Rolls-Royce, and the motor from a Volkswagen, and yeah, whatever. And then you fit them all together because you have benchmarked, and you've benchmarked on the best parts. But putting together all those best parts from Toyota and Volkswagen and all the other cars doesn't make a good car, because the prestation isn't in the parts, it's in the interaction. And you wouldn't manage to fit all those parts together. What you get is something very interesting, probably, but not a car. But it's exactly what happens when, in most cases, when people start to manage, they look at what are they doing well. Oh, wow, they have a lean program. We also have to have a lean program. And then they take superficially on what looks like a lean program. So that they all suddenly have this these whiteboards in the office where they write down what they do, and they have stand-up meetings each morning, and well, they count. Every department does this. So the lean process is going great. Does it really contribute? Does it work like it worked for Toyota? So often benchmarking is well, not what it should be, I think.
Yeah, that's a good example. I know we talked earlier about the series of seminars Ron Gant has been doing, and I've been attending this 3-week-long one every Friday morning with a guy named Nick, whose name I can't pronounce. He's in software, actually, so I apologize to Nick. But today we were reading we're reading philosophy texts. It's a series called Thinking About Thinking, and we're reading the post-structuralist Gilles Deleuze, I think is the correct pronunciation of his name. He's one of those guys around Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard and all those people. And he's talking about kind of the reductive nature of our thought patterns, almost kind of a prison house of language where, you know, we have this world out there, and then we actualize it and kind of reduce it into little components that are maybe easier for us to think about, or in lean, easier enough for us to borrow from Toyota, but maybe don't represent the whole world or don't fit into our system in the same way that they might somewhere else. It's been pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's and then just continuing on lean, then, for example,
Sure.
which a lot of organizations nicking from Toyota. but in a totally inappropriate way, because Toyota does actually production, but a lot of those organizations are not into production at all. They're like consultancy,
Right.
or government or whatever.
Right. Does that unit that you're taking out of this system easily fit into your system and work in the same way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what in closing, well, actually, I got two questions, but in the first one's about safety metrics. What would be your tips or advice for people who either want to get, working, improving their current safety metric system at work, or maybe start one?
Firstly, I would say find something that suits your organization and actually says something about your organization, rather than take something that everybody else has or that the regulator requires from you. You will probably have to do those also, but if you want to get a measure of your own safety, and then I mean a measure in as how well are you doing, find something that actually says something about what you are doing. And if you start measuring in what way ever, if you're counting or maybe collecting stories or thumbs up or smileys or whatever, don't use it as an answer, but, and I've said this a number of times today, use it as a way to start a conversation. What does it really mean? For a while, we had the system in my organization where we went away from the traditional reporting of numbers, where we set to our underlying units. We do not want numbers. We can look those up in the system ourselves because we have access to the system, so we can see the numbers. Tell us, what have you learned? What problems have you encountered? How did you solve those problems? What have you seen that others should know about? Tell us a story. And that took some time to develop. But at the end of the first year, we got some really great information. So that might be one way forward. It's a much harder way. I'm very much aware of that, because firstly, it may take more time, and it may also take some acceptance from controllers, etc., who are used to numbers or colors or smileys or whatever it is. They don't want long texts, and long texts don't look precise, and they look like excuses and whatever. But I think that's one way to get richer information. Just tell me.
I like that emphasis on storytelling. Okay, so in the interest of not being reductive and not focusing solely on numbers, I thought I'd end, because this is something that comes up a lot with you anyway, and I always find it interesting, and not to pigeonhole you as just a safety metric guy. Maybe we can end by having you tell us what band or album you're listening to most recently that you've been enjoying.
Yeah, what was that? I'm listening a lot to a Dutch artist called Allyn.
Ah.
And he made many years ago a concept album Into the Electric Castle, which is a way out psychedelic story, and he performed it live last year, and I'm playing that live album up and down lately.
And what was the name of the artist again?
Great.
I'm sorry.
Allyn.
Allyn. Is that
Ayreom?
All right. So there you go, everybody. The full expanse of Carsten. A music tip from about Allyn, and remember to pick up this book and earlier stuff as well. And Carsten, thanks a lot for being on. We appreciate it. And time for you to start your holiday weekend.
Thank you.
All right, man.
Thanks for listening.
Take care, man.